The restored community was a chastened people, yet they were also in need of frequent rebuke and reformation. Israel remained a wayward people. They still awaited the new covenant of which Jeremiah had spoken, and the renewal to be effected by God's Spirit, as announced by Joel and Ezekiel. As the last prophetic voice of the Old Testament, Malachi peered across the centuries to a time when the events spoken of by him and the prophets who preceded him would be fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. The Jews of the 5th century BC longed for the day of their national and spiritual restoration. But when was it to come? Malachi announced that God must first send Elijah, the prophet, to prepare the way. Malachi began his prophecy with the reassuring words, "I have loved you, says the Lord." He then reminded the Jews of their obligation, in the meantime, to respond to God with actions that would show their love for him. In this way, Malachi prepared the Jews to wait in obedient expectation for their coming Messiah. My covenant was with him, the priest tribe of Levi, a covenant of life and peace, and I gave them to him. This called for reverence, and he revered me and stood in awe of my name. True instruction was in his mouth, and nothing false was found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness, and turned many from sin. For the lips of a priest ought to preserve knowledge, and from his mouth men should seek instruction, because he is the messenger of the Lord Almighty. Malachi chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. But you, wayward priests, have turned from the way, and by your teaching have caused many to stumble. So I have caused you to be despised and humiliated before all the people, because you have not followed my ways. Malachi chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Guard yourself in your spirit, and do not break faith. Malachi chapter 2, verse 16. You have wearied the Lord with your words. How have we wearied him, you ask? By saying, all who do evil are good in the eyes of the Lord, and he is pleased with them. Or, where is the God of justice? Malachi chapter 2, verse 17. Who can stand when he appears? That's the Lord. For he will be like a refiner's fire, or a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. Malachi chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. I, the Lord, do not change. You have said harsh things against me, says the Lord. Yet you ask, what have we said against you? You have said, it is futile to serve God. What did we gain by carrying out his requirements and going about like mourners before the Lord Almighty? But now you call the arrogant blessed. Certainly the evildoers prosper, and even those who challenge God escape. Malachi chapter 3. They will be mine, that's the faithful, says the Lord Almighty, in the day when I make up my treasured possession. I will spare them, just as in compassion a man spares his son who serves him. and you will again see the distinction between the righteous and the wicked, between those who serve God and those who do not. Malachi chapter 3. Many have made the mistake of going directly from the Old Testament to the New Testament, dismissing the centuries between the close of the Old Testament period and the birth of Christ as the period when there was no prophecy, or indicating nothing really important went on during these years. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In the years between the work of Ezra and Nehemiah and the advent of Christ, the whole known world underwent fundamental changes that profoundly influenced the character of Judaism and the development of Christianity. Alexander the Great brought East and West together in a vast empire, and he initiated a program carried on by his successors to stamp Greek thought and culture upon the whole world. The Jews in Palestine and those scattered in foreign lands met this attempt in various ways, some with great enthusiasm, others with bitter resistance. Both attitudes left their mark upon the religion of Israel. In this period, the Maccabees, about whom everyone has heard, but many have no understanding, waged their brave struggle against the tyrannical kings of the Seleucid Empire. In this period arose the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Jewish sects that came to prominence in the New Testament. In this period, Palestine fell under the rule of Rome. Knowledge of the intertestamental period is essential to full understanding of the New Testament and its message. The rule of Darius I included the latter years of Daniel's life, and Xerxes I included the time of Esther. Each of these attempted to invade Greece, but are turned back. Later, Persian kings gave up plans for conquest, being content to simply keep the Greeks from encroaching on Persian territory. Besides rebellions within its own dominion, Persia's most significant threat becomes the growing power of the independent city-states of Greece. However, Persia's security was made easier by wars between these fiercely independent Greek city-states, such as the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, 434 to 404 BC. While the Greeks fought each other, the Peloponnesian Wars, the Persian kings, Artaxerxes I, which included the time of the return to Jerusalem under Ezra and later Nehemiah, and also the rules of Xerxes II and Darius II, they were able to concentrate their military forces in Asia Minor, making that area a buffer between Greece and the rest of the Persian Empire. No human glory lasts forever, and the glory of Persia and of the Greek city-states began to fail simultaneously. In Persia, the collapse came from within. After Artaxerxes II, Persia was ruled by a series of violent, ambitious men, most of whom gained the throne by assassinating their predecessor and all possible rivals. One of these, Artaxerxes III, seemed to be restoring Persian might. He even recaptured Egypt in 343 BC, but that return to glory was illusory. Artaxerxes III was poisoned and replaced by his son Arses. The threat to Greece came from without. From the land of Macedon to the north, the king of Macedon, Philip II, marched his armies south. By 338 BC, Philip's armies had captured the whole Greek peninsula. Although not a Greek himself, Philip had his son tutored in Greek thought by none other than the Greek thinker Aristotle. When Philip was murdered in 336 BC, his son was ready to expand both the kingdom of Macedon and the culture of Greece into the Persian territory. Philip's son was Alexander. Alexander the Great's conquests, in their swiftness and effectiveness, are the stuff of military legend. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor and overcame all opposition. He met the main Persian force under Darius III in 333 at Issus in Upper Syria and routed it, sending Darius himself fleeing. Before pressing on into Mesopotamia, the center of Persian power, Alexander marched south and conquered Palestine and Egypt in 332 BC. With the west in hand, Alexander resumed his eastward push. In 331 BC, he crossed Mesopotamia to Arbela, where he crushed what remained of Darius's army. All of Persia was now Alexander's. Despite continuous conflict between the Greek city-states, this century was the golden age in Greece. The city of Athens, which had led the Greek alliance against Darius I and Xerxes I, became the center of Greek politics, literature, and philosophy. In Athenian politics, this was the age of Pericles. In literature, this century saw such Greek dramatists as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Athenian philosophers of this time included Socrates, Plato, and near the end of the century, Aristotle. Despite great diversity, Greek art and thought shared a few significant presuppositions. Most important of these was a new emphasis on the beauty and value of the human being. Before this time, most cultures saw people as weak creatures, helpless before the more powerful forces of nature and of the gods. In 5th century Greece, BC, this view changed. Humans came to be perceived as having intrinsic value as well as the strength to overcome, or at least endure, the worst that fate or the gods could offer. The Stoic philosopher Protagoras summarized this humanism with his dictum, "Man is the measure of all things." This philosophical position was to prove much more enduring and influential in world history than any of the military or political achievements of Athens. After receiving the homage of the people of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the three major capitals of the Persian Empire, Alexander continued to march toward the east, laying claim to everything in his path. When he reached the Indus River in 327, according to popular legend, Alexander wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. Now that the world belonged to him, Alexander resolved to unite it in the bond of Greek culture. Hellas is another name for Greece. The words Hellenism and Hellenistic are used to refer to the thought and culture that originated in Greece and spread over most of the known world after the conquests of Alexander. Hellenism affected every facet of life that it touched: political, social, intellectual, and religious. Perhaps no period in the world's history has had a more lasting impact on the thought and behavior of humanity than the Hellenistic period. Alexander became ill and died in 323 BC, shortly before his 33rd birthday, but his dream did not die with him. When Alexander died, no one man was able to take charge of the vast empire that he had created. Instead, it was divided among his leading generals. The most important of these was Seleucus and Ptolemy. Seleucus gained control of Mesopotamia and Syria and established his capital at Antioch in Syria. Ptolemy seized Egypt and established his capital at Alexandria, a new city built in honor of Alexander. Both Ptolemy and Seleucus, as well as their successors, shared Alexander's dream of a world united by Greek culture. Antioch and Alexandria became great centers of learning and progress. In Alexandria, the greater of the two cities, the Ptolemies founded scientific research institutes, museums, centers for the arts, and one of the finest libraries the world has ever seen. Once again, Palestine was a buffer zone between rival nations. Both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids sought to control her. Eventually both did. For virtually all of the 3rd century BC, Palestine was a Ptolemaic province. During this century of Greek-Egyptian domination, thousands of Jews migrated from Palestine to Egypt. Great numbers of them settled in Alexandria, so many in fact that Alexandria soon became one of the great world centers of Judaism, and a large section of the city was recognized to be the Jewish quarter. Greek was the official language in Ptolemaic Egypt. Soon, just as the Jews in Palestine had adopted Aramaic as their everyday language, so the Jews living in Egypt began to speak Greek. Before long, a large portion of Egyptian Jews were unable to read the Hebrew Scriptures. To meet this crisis, a translation of the Scriptures into Greek was made. This translation is called the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70. According to history, describing the work, it was accomplished by about 70 scholars. The Septuagint not only enabled Greek-speaking Jews to remain faithful to the law, it gave them a valuable instrument for communicating their faith to the Gentile world. The Jews had relative freedom to run their affairs as they pleased. As long as they paid their taxes and stayed out of trouble, the Ptolemies showed little interest in pressing their culture on the Jews. All this changed when the Seleucids gained control of Palestine. Meanwhile, 200 miles across the Adriatic Sea, west of Greece, growth of the Roman Republic. The three Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome took place over nearly a century, beginning in 264 BC and ending with the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. By the time the First Punic War broke out, Rome had become the dominant power throughout the Italian peninsula, while Carthage, a powerful city-state in northern Africa, had established itself as the leading maritime power in the world. "40 years after the beginning of the nearly 120 years of fighting between Rome and Carthage, Antiochus III became king of the Hellenistic or Seleucid Greek Syrian Empire in 223 BC. After a quarter century of vigorous campaigning, the Seleucid holdings expanded to include Palestine, after pushing the Ptolemies back into Egypt. In the beginning, Antiochus went out of his way to win the support and confidence of the Jews. However, Antiochus failed to understand his limitations, hurling a challenge at the rising Western power, Rome. Overlapping their intense struggle with the Carthaginians as the Punic Wars continued, the Romans at first tried to merely keep the Greeks, an ally of Carthage, busy with a series of skirmishes, hoping to limit Grecian interference with the war. However, 5 years after the end of the first of the Punic Wars, Rome met the challenge of the Greeks, whom had allied themselves with Carthage, led by Hannibal. The Macedonian Wars were a series of conflicts fought by the Roman Republic against several Greek kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean. The result was Roman control or influence over the eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Punic Wars. Where at first the Romans were only interested in holding off the intervention of the Greeks, now there was a new strategy, one of conquest with perhaps not a small taste for vengeance. Rome had gained dominance by defeating Carthage, led by Hannibal, in 202 BC. Antiochus correctly saw this as a threat to his own position and moved back into Greece to discourage Rome from pushing further eastward. He could not have made a more serious mistake. The Romans pushed him back into Asia and crushed him on his home grounds. In 190 BC, after a decisive victory at Magnesia, the Romans stripped Antiochus of most of his defenses and placed him under a crippling tribute. The heyday of the Seleucid Empire was over almost before it had begun. After Antiochus was slain in 187 BC, while plundering a temple in Elam to raise tribute money, his son Seleucus IV came to the throne. He reigned 12 years before he was assassinated and succeeded by his brother Antiochus IV, better known as Antiochus Epiphanes. The latter title was given him because he claimed to be the human epiphany or manifestation of Zeus, the high god of the Greeks. As might be expected of a man who claimed to be a Greek god, Antiochus Epiphanes had rather strong opinions about the worth of Greek culture and about his royal authority. With regard to the first, he was determined to press the Greek way on all of his subjects, partly because he believed it was a superior way of life, and partly because it would serve to unify his kingdom in the face of the Roman threat. With regard to the second, he demanded absolute submission to his will, not simply as a test of political loyalty, but as a sign of allegiance to Zeus. For the Jews, however, there could be no God besides Yahweh. Conflict between Antiochus Epiphanes and the Jews was inevitable. Antiochus sold the position of the high priest to the highest bidding Hellenizer. Jason, a Hellenizing Jew, had a Greek-style gymnasium set up in Jerusalem and encouraged young Jews, including priests of the temple, to participate in its activities. The word comes from a Greek word gymnos, which means naked. In ancient Greece, the gymnasium was the center for physical and intellectual education for aristocratic adolescent boys. It involved paying homage to the Greek gods who were believed to watch over the gymnasium. In other words, it involved idolatry. The gymnasium originated in Athens, where the citizens sought the ideals espoused by Pericles, that men should have wisdom without the loss of manly vigor. Physical education included wrestling, swimming, running, and use of the bow and sling, all in the nude. Intellectually, the boys were trained in reading, writing, mathematics, politics, philosophy, and music. As time passed, the gymnasiums became open to all citizens and were an integral part of all Greek cities. Aristocratic Jewish young men began to frequent the gymnasium and to participate in Greek activities. The pious Jews were shocked at both their nudity, prohibited by Jews, and their practice of wearing the broad-brimmed Greek hats, associated with the worship of the Greek god Hermes. In addition, some of the young men became ashamed of and tried to hide their circumcision. The reaction of faithful Jews was loud and bitter. The presence of such an establishment in Jerusalem was a gross scandal to pious Jews. The fact that it had been built by the high priest himself was an outrage almost beyond belief. Riots broke out. Menelaus, the high priest, was driven from the city. Antiochus quelled the riots. Menelaus was given a firm grip on the high priesthood and punished the Jews for resisting the royal policy. Antiochus plundered the Jewish temple. To lessen the chances of organized resistance, Antiochus Epiphanes launched a surprise attack on Jerusalem, slaughtering a sizable portion of the population and tearing down the walls. He followed this by building a fortress that would allow him to keep a garrison permanently stationed in Jerusalem. He began a frontal assault on Judaism itself, for it was the faith of Israel that was the real obstacle to Antiochus's ambitions. Antiochus missed no detail in his program to exterminate Judaism. All copies of the law were to be destroyed. Circumcision of children was forbidden. Feast days and Sabbaths were outlawed. Pagan altars were set up, and Jews were forced to eat the meat of pigs that had been sacrificed on them. Failure to comply with these orders was punishable by death. Finally, as the capstone of offense, Antiochus Epiphanes set up an altar to Zeus within the holy temple itself and offered a pig as a burnt offering to the Greek deity. There could be no greater sacrilege than this. To pious Jews, it was truly what the book of Daniel calls the abomination of desolation.